Welcome back to C2C Journal. Today we're exploring a new vision for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, one that moves beyond apologies and symbolism and instead focuses on practical improvements and economic participation. Joining us here today is Tom Flanagan, academic, longtime contributor to C2C Journal, and author of his latest essay, Owning Up, A Path to Indigenous Reconciliation. Drawing on decades of experience in Indigenous affairs, Tom proposes a more effective path forward through incremental, community-driven ownership in resource projects. Tom, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Okay, pleasure.
So in his essay, Tom argues that the current model, built on blame, guilt, and endless financial transfers, has failed to improve conditions in Indigenous communities. Instead, he proposes a more effective path forward, encouraging Indigenous ownership in natural resource projects and supporting incremental, locally led development that creates real opportunity. So, Tom, let's dive right into it. Your essay begins by outlining how our current reconciliation efforts, like land acknowledgements and funding transfers, haven't really translated into real progress. So, can you explain what's missing in these approaches?
Yeah, well, several things. I mean, a lot of it is just based on trying to heighten a sense of guilt in the larger population. Um, the but it goes beyond the symbolism and the guilt. Um, the compensation, the reparations part of it
Mhm.
has been enormously expensive. It's up in well, it's still ongoing, so we don't know the total, but it's way up in the tens of billions of dollars
Yes.
have been spent for compensation for alleged wrongs in the past,
Mhm.
starting with residential schools, but then expanding it into other things like the Indian hospitals or the issue of water supply and so on. And there seems to be no end to this. Now, all this money, almost all of it goes to individuals in the form of untaxed cash payments, and then it disappeared. It's probably spent on current consumption,
Mhm.
uh, maybe buying a new truck, or maybe not a bad thing, but what's the long term benefit? So I think we've got to shift our thinking from worrying about the past and thinking how do we best improve the standard of living and other all conditions for, well, not just for Indigenous people, but for all Canadians in the future. We have to become more future oriented instead of ransacking the past for grievances.
You also make a key argument in your piece that political governance hasn't solved core issues like housing, education, and job creation. Can you elaborate on why governance alone hasn't worked?
Well, yeah, government. The purpose of government is to create a peaceable framework for economic activity, uh, secure property rights and other kinds of rights, so that people can pursue their own projects in life. But government in itself doesn't supply a good life. Government makes it, when it's working properly, government should make it possible to provide themselves with a better life. But one of the tragedies of our Native affairs in Canada, going back many, many decades, it's created a kind of dependence on government, where government is expected to, and I'm talking mainly the federal government because they have constitutional responsibility. They're so the Indians will demand that federal government furnish them with clean water, for example.
Mhm.
Well, communities, the rest of Canada, communities find their own water. They dig a well, or they build a treatment plant for the water from the nearest river, or they buy water from some other town. But they take an action where you don't go to a senior government and demand it. Similarly with housing, people would get a mortgage and buy a house, or they rent an apartment. But there's constant demands that the government should furnish more houses for Native people, and not just Indians on reserves, there are demands for houses for Métis or non-status Indians living off reserve. So, if government could furnish a high standard of living, the Soviet Union would have been a great success, but it didn't turn out that way.
Absolutely. So you point to a different approach, right, where it comes to economic participation, particularly in resource projects, and you say that's a promising avenue. Can you give us some examples of how ownership and equity stakes can really make a difference in communities?
Yeah. If you look at the broad run of First Nations communities in Canada, there's roughly 640 of them. They have 2,000 plus land reserves. Some of the reserves are small, but anyway, they're scattered around the country. There's two main pathways towards prosperity. Those that are close to metropolitan centers, and that I would include major centers like Vancouver and Calgary, but also small, medium-sized towns that have something going on. The First Nations communities there have lots of opportunities to use their reserves for real estate development, for business premises. It can be residential, it can be commercial, it can be industrial. But there's lots of opportunities, and you have that happening. The one that I've studied most carefully is Westbank in the Okanagan, a highly successful community based on real estate development, both residential and commercial. The other big opportunity for First Nations is, and this would be the majority of them, several hundred, who are located far from any town or city, but often are close to natural resource plays of one kind or another. It can be hard rock mining, as it is in Northern Ontario. It can be oil and gas, both production of oil and gas and transportation through pipelines, as it is in Saskatchewan and Alberta and British Columbia. It can be other things as well. It can be salmon fisheries or fisheries of any kind on coastal waters. It could be recreational, hunting and fishing lodges in scenic wilderness areas. So I'm not saying every First Nation will have an opportunity, but many will have opportunities based on use of natural resources. And I think the best case to look at there is Fort McKay First Nation in northern Alberta, which is located in the heart of the oil sands. As far as I know, they've never produced a drop of oil on their own, but they set up service countries, service companies like janitorial, well site maintenance, workforce lodging, logistics. And then they have contracts with the various oil producers, and they've become quite a wealthy reserve with a high standard of living for their people. And in fact, they borrowed a lot of money to buy a share of the Suncor tank farm, but they didn't have to even get a loan guarantee there. So their credit is so good that they were able to float a bond issue for it, using the oil in the tanks as security. So there are a lot of different options, and you can't say it's going to be exactly the same for everybody, but the general pattern, in my view, is either real estate development or natural resource development, either production or transportation of natural resources. And both of those will probably involve borrowed money at some point. All real estate development involves mortgages. No developer does it all with their own money. And the same will be true for First Nations. So whether you're talking about shopping centers and residential projects close to cities, or whether you're talking about oil wells and pipelines and hard rock mines out in the wilderness, there's going to be a role for borrowing, and the government can be helpful there, although there are risks as well. But government can certainly be helpful in getting those First Nations that want to pursue an entrepreneurial direction.
Right.
Yeah, I call it community capitalism. I don't use that term in this essay, but in another essay about Fort McKay, I use the term community capitalism to describe what they have done up there. So that's in general, I think, is the most promising direction, rather than endless welfare type handouts where government pays for better, cleaner water, better housing, whatever. Yeah, there may be some temporary boost, but it usually doesn't last. You have to become self-sustaining,
Absolutely.
and that's where development, as I've tried to describe it, I think comes into play.
Absolutely. Can you also touch on education and entrepreneurship? I know you mentioned entrepreneurship a little bit, but if you can kind of go into a little bit more detail about where that fits into the equation as well.
Well, yeah, education is important, but it's not necessarily the most important thing. Some of the most successful chiefs who've led their nation in an entrepreneurial direction are just have basic, maybe high school education. There certainly is a role for education, but I think it's a mistake to think that everything depends upon formal education.
Mhm.
Um, there are more and more Native people now going to our colleges and universities, but unfortunately, in my opinion, this is a personal opinion,
Mhm.
um, I think too many are studying non-constructive things. There's a big flood into law school, and they all want to graduate and sue the government.
Mhm.
That's wrong to say they all do, but many do.
Mhm.
Um, or they get into things like Native studies, which easily becomes kind of a grievance studies thing.
Yeah.
I wish we had more of our Native people studying accounting and engineering. I mean, we have some, but I wish we had more studying these disciplines which generate wealth.
Right.
Um, and so it's not just number of years in school, but it's also what you're studying. I mean, this will probably sort itself out over time, but in the early years of First Nations people flooding into universities, there has been a tendency to study things that don't necessarily create wealth. So my hats are off to those who have studied accounting and engineering and are leading the charge to create more wealth, but we just need a lot more of that. But education is a problem. I mean, with the residential patterns of hundreds of thousands of people living in remote communities,
Mhm.
uh, and the educational responsibility has been largely transferred to First Nations themselves. They said we didn't like residential schools, we didn't like the government's day schools, we didn't want to send our kids into towns. But so now they're running hundreds of their own schools um, in these remote areas, and it's not so much that the physical facilities are primitive, but they're in these isolated communities. There may not be much of a culture of improvement through education. I mean, kids can learn almost anywhere
Mhm.
uh, if their families are leading them in that direction. But unfortunately, there is not a strong history of respect for formal education in these remote communities. And you talk to teachers who've been there, and they talk about very poor attendance and so on. So uh, I don't claim to have a solution. Mr. Harper, when he was prime minister, tried to uh, negotiate a solution with the Assembly of First Nations in which the federal government would increase the budget for schools and the responsibility would be lodged with the First Nations, but there would be accountability mechanisms to see whether their schools were doing the job. But the agreement fell apart. The First Assembly of First Nations, they wanted the money, but they didn't want any kind of external accountability. So it's very spotty now. There are some successful schools for sure, but uh, education remains a huge problem, and I don't claim to have a practical answer to it. have to hope that somebody else will.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a loaded question, and I think that could be a debate in itself, whether education in today's day and age is as useful as it used to be. I think there's a big cultural shift going on right now, where young people are choosing not to pursue a formal education and go straight into the job market, or pursue a trade, or go to college instead to get that kind of real world experience rather than something more theoretical, especially, the social studies aspect of things. So, I mean, that could be a whole other conversation whether university stays are as useful as they once used to be.
Well, this is one of the spin-off benefits of an entrepreneurial focus. If we can get First Nations involved in opening up mines and building pipelines and power lines and so forth. I mean, these create high-paying jobs. You might call them manual labor or skilled manual labor. But Alberta is full of young people who went to high school and maybe took a trades course afterwards, and now they're out in their pickup trucks making six figures, doing all kinds of stuff with pipelines, and they're living in my neighborhood. And there's a lot of professionals in my neighborhood, but there's a lot of guys driving into their trucks as well because they're making comparable money out on the rigs. So, the more of the First Nations people we can get acquiring solid trade skills like pipe fitting and plumbing and electrical and carpentry and so forth on a project, and maybe they could transfer those later working in other projects, so you get sort of a self-sustaining thing. So I actually have more hope for that than I do for necessarily packing more Native people into university courses that don't necessarily lead anywhere. I mean, initially there was a huge demand for Native people with some education that had been to a university, get familiarized with Canada's government and so forth, just to go back and do the administrative work in the bands. I mean, at one time, bands were run almost entirely with outsiders that were hired to manage it. So there was a huge demand, but I think that's been largely, maybe not entirely, but largely filled now. There are now lots of young people, Native people with basic educational credentials that can work in the band office. But now we need to have the wealth creators, the engineers and the entrepreneurs and the accountants that can move the living standard forward, not just administer what the government gives them, but understand how to create more wealth for themselves.
Absolutely. And you also argue in your essay about incrementalism, right? So building capacity through gradual, practical steps. Can you kind of walk us through what changes or policies you would want to see to make all your proposed ideas come to fruition?
Well, this is actually kind of a negative point in a way. There's a lot of people in Canada with grand visions of what Indigenous policy should be. They see all these enormous problems of low living standard, social pathologies, and so forth, and so they say, "Gee, things are terrible. We need fundamental change. So we need to abolish the Indian Act, for example. We need to repeal the Indian Act." That's a favorite on both the right and the left, actually, politically. Everybody likes to kick the Indian Act. Others want to go further. They say Indians can never prosper living in these remote places. We have to move them to better places. Or Indian leaders will say we can never prosper with all these white people around. We got to get our land back. Now there's a whole land back movement. But none of these grand visions has any success of any chance of success. If for a very simple reason that well, it's not simple, but it's a basic reason that so much of Indian or Native policy has been made part of the Constitution, going back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and carrying on most prominently up to the constitutional amendments of 1982, and then the way the courts have interpreted Section 35. I mean, all this stuff now is beyond the reach uh, of politicians. You can't move Indians off their reserves. The reserves are granted by their treaties unless they want to move. The courts are not going to let you do that. For example, you can't repeal the Indian Act without replacing it with Indian Act 2.0 because First Nations are they don't like to be called this, but they are in fact like small communities scattered across the country. But instead of being governed by the province, they're governed by the federal government. Every province has a Municipalities Act, which sets out the rights and prerogatives of local government. Well, that's what the Indian Act is. It's among other things, it's a Municipalities Act for First Nations. So yeah, you could repeal it and replace it with some other piece of legislation, give it a grand sounding title. But what it would be a Municipalities Act for First Nations. It has to be. You can't have 600 governments tearing up the countryside with no legal framework for them. Nobody would know how to deal with them. And they wouldn't be able to get credit. They wouldn't be able to enter into agreements because nobody would know, how to proceed. So that's why I say I've given up. I used to play with some of these big ideas, but I've seen them all fail. That's the only advantage to being as old as I am, is that you've seen a lot of failures in the past. So I say let's go for incremental progress, which is dependent upon the initiative of the First Nations and Métis communities themselves. As much as possible, let's get out of the way. The federal government has been the biggest offender in the last 10 years, blocking one resource project after another, or creating conditions which allow relatively small local groups to block them. So Ontario hasn't developed this ring of fire. We don't have as many oil pipelines or gas pipelines as we need. We have very little export of liquefied natural gas. There's all these opportunities that we lost out on, and all of them would have created thousands of jobs. Excuse me, some temporary, but some permanent for First Nations and Métis people. So let's get out of the way. Let's facilitate these projects rather than block them. And so I call that incremental progress. It's a step at a time. It's not coordinated. It's not directed. It's each community doing what seems best to it, taking advantage of local opportunities within a legal framework that doesn't allow others to block what they want to do. So that's my vision, if you want to call it that. It's a non-vision vision. That's
a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's a vision of usually when people talk about visions, they usually have in mind something that's highly coordinated and directed, and something that ultimately they want to control it. And I say we can't control this. We just create conditions for people to make better lives for themselves. And government can have a role in that, and loan guarantees might be part of it, although there is a risk with those. But anyway, that's my non-vision vision.
Oh, absolutely. And finally, to all our readers, either reading your article or watching this interview, what is one takeaway you want our readers to take from our discussion as well as your essay?
Well, lay off the guilt trip. We've had enough guilt. Maybe Europeans should not have come to America over the last 400 years, but they did, and they're here. And maybe they should have treated the natives differently, but things happened as they did. And so let's all get together and create conditions for people to make better lives for themselves in the future, instead of just endless moralizing about the past. See, that's the trouble, for example, with land acknowledgements, because the whole purpose of a land acknowledgement is to make people in the audience feel kind of vaguely guilty. They don't know exactly what the legal mumbo jumbo means, but it makes them feel that, gee, somehow we're on land that isn't ours. Well, I got
Mhm.
this land is ours. It's yours too, but it's everybody's land with certain legal formulas, and let's build on that instead of trying to make people feel guilty. I think the guilt is more than anything else. The guilt is driving people in non-constructive um, directions, suing the government for reparations, and uh, it just gets worse and worse. Like the reparations thing started with 2005 with the residential schools agreement.
Mhm.
Mr. Harper, I think, signed on to it thinking this would be the end, but
Mhm.
it was just the beginning.
Right.
Lawsuit after lawsuit, they get bigger and bigger. The last one had a $40 billion plus settlement. I mean, my God,
Oh, wow.
uh, where's the well, anyway, I'm going on too long.
No, I mean, these are all extremely valid points. And you point to the guilt being a huge factor, and perhaps that's the roadblock in itself from making tangible progress forward.
You can, you can be aware of past wrongs, but that's different from trying to build your life around.
Absolutely.
We all have past wrongs in our ethnic history. My ancestors would have died in the potato famine in Ireland if they
Mhm.
had gotten to the United States. Now we have all these refugees in Canada, we have Ukrainians fleeing massacre. I mean, everybody's got stories, and but they're gone, they're past.
Mhm.
It doesn't do any good for me to hate the British for what they did to my great great grandfather.
Mhm.
Drove him out of the country at 1847.
All right.
Uh, Best thing that ever happened to the Irish was to get out of Ireland. So I'm not saying that the best thing that would happen for Indians would be to get out of Canada. I don't think that at all. But um, the past is the past, and focusing on the past can be interesting and even entertaining and tragic and all that heartstrings. But ultimately, building a better life in the future requires a different mindset that's looking ahead.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great message, Tom. Thank you so much for walking us through this very important perspective on Indigenous reconciliation. And to our audience watching, to dive into this topic further and explore the full essay, Owning Up, A New Path to Indigenous Reconciliation, you can read it in the description down below. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. And Tom, it was great to have you. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Glad to do it.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.